Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, and everyone for coming to chat with me. I'm hoping to kind of go over the general arc of my presentation, but hoping to leave a lot of time for discussion and conversation afterwards. So, as I already mentioned, feel free to jump in at any point and ask questions. So yeah, again, my talk is titled TESCREAL, Hallucinations, Psychedelic and AI Hype as Inequality Engines. And I'll explain what TESCREAL means in just a little bit. And just as some background to the kind of work that I do in this field. So I started working in psychedelic studies back in 2010 publicly in the field. So my personal interest pre-existed that. Back to 2006, I decided that this is what I wanted to study, but I, for a while, thought that I had to be covert in my interests. And so I actually had applied to graduate school to study romantic poetry because I discovered Acid and William Blake the same semester of undergrad, and I felt like there was a lot of parallels, and I could essentially talk about my psychedelic interests through the romantic poets. But this was my first Breaking Convention talk back in 2011, where I have since then really been making a case for the value of the humanities, specifically within the larger field of psychedelic studies. Another important piece of context for my perspective and framing around these materials is that I used to be very much like an insider in the dominant scientific field. So this is a picture of me volunteering for MAPS back in 2011. And similarly, in 2013 and 2017, I was invited to the kind of like invitational researchers meeting after psychedelic science, the conference those years. So I circled myself in blue because a lot of people more recently know me for my critical work, but my critical work is informed by having been kind of embedded in the more dominant side of the field for many years. And this paper in particular is I would say a synthesis of all of my prior research. And my research really has fallen into two buckets, you could say. So on the one hand, there's psychedelic literary studies, going back to my original interests in poetics and romanticism. And that includes my book project that I'm working on, Chemical Poetics, the literary history of psychedelic science, looking at literary representations of psychedelic experience. And then I've also written about kind of the role of metaphors and other literary devices in trip experiences. I've looked at qualitative research from clinical trials. And then there's the critical psychedelic studies side of things. And so critical psychedelic studies, the word critical kind of parallels how there's also like critical medical humanities. And that word is essentially, there's different ways of looking at it, but it's a way of kind of thinking about power and dominant assumptions and how some of the conventional ways of approaching conversations are embedded within like other unacknowledged assumptions, and just trying to kind of interrogate what we assume to know about the field. So yeah, I've written and talked about the potential pitfalls involved in a field where there's widespread ideological and financial conflicts of interest. I've done bioethics collaborations with former clinical trial participants who had experiences of harm in clinical trials. And I've also worked with many years with Symposia, which is known as a kind of watchdog organization for the psychedelics industry. And all of that experience really set me up for the kind of analysis that I did in this recent paper that just came out a little while ago. And among that previous work that I've done, one of the biggest precursors to this current paper was this paper I did published back in 2021 with my colleague Brian Pace called Right-Wing Psychedelia, Case Studies in Cultural Plasticity and Political Pluripotency. And essentially what we were arguing in that paper is, well, that paper was an intervention into kind of a lot of the dominant ways of talking about psychedelics. There was a lot of kind of uncritical, simplistic assumptions that were circulating in some quarters of the field that was suggesting that we just need to get psychedelics out to, as many people as possible, and that will solve problems that we're having with, society, politics, climate change, because psychedelics are going to make people more open-minded, more pro-environmental, more having more empathy, caring about people who are different from them. But we were making the case in this article that there's a lot of cross-cultural and historical evidence that points to the idea that psychedelics can amplify all kinds of different political beliefs and not necessarily pro-social, pro-environmental oriented ones. And the kind of, for me, the main takeaway I had from working on this paper was the realization that authoritarian beliefs in particular can prime people to interpret psychedelic experiences of interconnection specifically as confirmations of status hierarchies. So the way that people often think of interconnection is the sense of, I am connected to all that is, and therefore I have greater empathy even for people who are different from me because we're all one. But I was noticing as I was doing my research on this paper that all one can mean we are all one attached to this kind of caste system wherein I am the necessary kind of leader. And that fits very much with the kind of, tendency for guru messianic leadership styles in psychedelic cults, especially, but you also see it in other examples as well. And part of my interest in this perspective goes back to my literary training, because as I mentioned, I trained as a romanticist, and part of that, most of my work was around 1800 English literature, but I also went a bit earlier to provide context for some of that writing. And this was a text I have taught, Alexander Pope's An Essay on Man, 1733, in a class that's looking at the ways that kind of early ideas of higher dimensions and lower dimensions of reality, partially informed by the development of the telescope and microscope, opened up ways of kind of inspired just different literary engagements. And then in this example specifically, Alexander Pope is talking about this great chain of being, which is an idea that preceded when he was writing by centuries. But so here, this specific little excerpt that I'm showing here is Alexander Pope telling people, or kind of guiding the reader to see this kind of cosmic interconnection between the human, the cosmos, the microcosmos, and then essentially making the argument that, who are you to question anything? You are literally insignificant in this grand scheme of things. And so you need to submit and not question. Anything that's, and it mentions towards the bottom, all partial evil is universal good. So something might look like it's wrong to you, but that's just because you have a small perception. And this is an example of how ideology can interpret through the lens of interconnection, even cosmic interconnection, the idea that existing power structures are the way that things need to be. And the other reason why I wanted to share this excerpt here is because there is this threat, there is this anger kind of that comes through in the description, that it not only is it wrong for you to challenge this cosmic hierarchy, but if you do try to go against the established order, you are jeopardizing the entire cosmic order of reality. So it says towards the top, if one step is broken on this great chain linking everything together, the whole scale, that great scale, is destroyed. It doesn't matter what link you break, it breaks the whole chain alike. And so I see this a lot, this kind of idea, this very conservative, establishing the, justifying the existing power structure in society. I see this kind of idea being used to justify why, not just is it wrong to question power, but questioning power is a threat that then deserves kind of pushback, essentially. So there's a whole history to this kind of idea of interpreting interconnection in a hierarchical way that justifies justifies some people being in power and others not. So it's an essentially anti-democratic way of thinking about the sorts of interconnection that can come up through psychedelic experiences. And from that perspective, I mean, that kind of my thinking about that in literature has informed my thinking about when people have recommended, we just need to get billionaires to trip. We just need to get billionaires to go to outer space. And this relates to, it's a kind of metaphor for psychedelic experience, this overview effect concept. And so it goes back to a recurring pattern of astronauts going into space, seeing what Carl Sagan would describe as the pale blue dot of the Earth hanging in the dark void, and then becoming overwhelmed with a sense of compassion and connection to like all of humanity and all of life and how precious that is, and feeling changed. Like people describe feeling changed by psychedelic experiences often. But so some people were hoping that people like Bezos, behind Amazon, would go to space and then suddenly want to give, pay taxes and invest into society rather than, concentrating wealth in his own hands. But when he came back, he had just like new ideas, or probably pre-planned, but expressed ideas for new ways of making money, with space. That is what he said when he landed from that experience. So there's nothing inherent to the type of experience, I would say, that necessarily makes people more empathetic and more democratic in terms of like wanting to share power. It can happen, doesn't need to happen. And I would say that the pre-existing assumptions and the effects of having power on even cognition predispose billionaires to interpret these senses of these experiences of interconnection as, it's right that I'm in charge. It's right that I have the money. It's right that I'm making the decisions for society. And that relates to this more recent direct connection between billionaires and psychedelics. Not that they weren't taking it before, but this was recent in the sense that this was recently on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, which is essentially the paper of record of finance in the United States, with impact on the rest of the world as well. And then there was this article. This was like as I was kind of wrapping up my paper, very much touching on themes that I was exploring, as I'll explain in just a bit. But here, the title on the cover was "The Drugs That Power Tech: Ketamine, LSD, Mushrooms." So some people, would say this is just a good thing that billionaires are tripping. They're going to be more empathetic. They're going to use their vast wealth to benefit humanity. But I think that it's a lot more complicated than that. And so just these were things I touched on in my paper. But so in this article specifically names many of Silicon Valley's tech billionaires, including Elon Musk and Google's Sergey Brin, as specifically, quote, part of a drug movement that is embracing psychedelics as gateways to business breakthroughs. And they also note that for many of Silicon Valley's tech elites, taking psychedelics is now a practice that has become, for many, a routine part of doing business. And that within this community, psychedelics are framed as offering the fastest path to opening your mind up and clearly seeing for yourself what's going on. And that phrase, clearly seeing what's going on, I just asked you to kind of think about what that might mean in this context, because I think some people would read that who have had maybe their own experiences of empathy-based interconnection and read it as, oh, well, they are just, maybe seeing that we're all one and we're all connected and we need to care about the well-being of everybody. But I think there's actually a different interpretation that has become widespread in Silicon Valley. And that's what I'm going to kind of start to move into. And just to give some background on how my paper came about, I started noticing, this is just a screenshot from Twitter, I started noticing parallels, after basically ChatGPT became very popular and encouraged a lot of hype around generative AI in the popular media. I started noticing on Twitter that a lot of the critical AI scholars were arguing things and facing similar pushback as what I was seeing and experiencing, and seeing of others in the psychedelics field. the same types of arguments about concerns and the same kinds of misunderstandings about what the core of the concern is from people with different perspectives. And what I mean by that is that here, so I include Emily Bender is a critical AI scholar, and she was really emphasizing that in this quote this tweet that I quoted, she was pointing out that for people that were expressing concerns, people were often presenting that as if they were concerned with the tech in isolation, framing it as criticism lobbed at large language models, which is a type of artificial intelligence. And Emily here was emphasizing that the criticism is not of the tech, it is not of the large language models. The concerns are the use of those models, the development of those models specifically by capitalists that are trying to increase inequality in society. And so I was kind of started tracking some of this, like, because it resonated with some of the concerns I had with psychedelics, where a lot of people have interpreted, whether some of what I've said or some of my colleagues as being anti-psychedelic. And that's part of why at Breaking Convention, I titled my talk, "You can be both pro-psychedelics and anti-hype," because I think part of the problem is that some of the hype is actually driven by profit sorts of interests, and that if we are to develop psychedelics tuned towards or optimized for profit, that's going to necessarily work against the goals of healing. And where things really started to click for me was this Guardian article by Naomi Klein, who wrote, AI machines aren't hallucinating, but their makers are. And so she was in this paper, this essay, referencing the fact that people have started using the term hallucination to describe generative AI throwing up, things that read grammatically accurately and sound like they could be true, but are actually just pure fabrications. And so I actually prefer, as other AI scholars prefer, the word fabrication, because it doesn't imply essentially, like, so basically what Naomi Klein argues is that calling it hallucinations is implying that AI is sort of like a baby waking up, and it's like starting to experience reality, and it's just a matter of time before the baby grows up and we have what's called artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And in this article, Naomi Klein points out that fantasy, as she refers to it, this idea that we're just on the cusp of creating this like vast super intelligence that is in some cases portrayed as what all of cosmic development has been building up to, that is being used by some of these corporations to justify very quickly developing and building up this tech in a way that is not necessarily being designed in a pro-social way. So, and she even had mentioned the kind of parallels between genuine psychedelic insights and illusory tripping, and said basically the tech overlords, the billionaires, are tripping on their own hubris and kind of using some of this framing to justify moving full speed ahead in ways that are just lining their own pockets. And some of the core parallels that I saw between Naomi Klein's argument about AI and what I was concerned about with psychedelics relates to some of these ideas that I'll show on the screen. So the first one is that she was saying there is a world in which generative AI could indeed be marshaled to benefit humanity. So again, the tech is not the problem. And then not just humanity, but also other species in our shared home. But for that to happen, these technologies would need to be deployed inside a vastly different economic and social order than our own, one that had as its purpose the meeting of human needs and the protection of the planet. In today's reality of hyper-concentrated power and wealth, AI is much more likely to become a fearsome tool of further inequality. So that, there's all these promises, she was saying, about fixing the world. But if we're doing it in a way that is just accelerating inequality, we can't expect that to actually happen. And one of the examples that she points to that I've been trying to make for a while with psychedelic discourse is this, all the promises that we just, we need psychedelics and AI to fix problems like political polarization, the rise of fascism, climate change, the mental health crisis. But as I argued in my talk at Breaking Convention, all of those things are actually informed significantly by inequality in society. And that's why Naomi Klein here says the climate crisis, and I made the connection to the mental health crisis as well, it's not, in fact, a mystery or a riddle we haven't yet solved. We know what it would take, but it's not a quick fix. It's a paradigm shift. Waiting for a more palatable and or profitable answer is not a cure for this crisis. It's one more symptom of it. So she's saying that the impulse to want to profit to fix these problems is itself a reflection of the underlying problems themselves. And so once all this stuff kind of came together, I was seeing the parallels. I was seeing some of these arguments happening around AI. Then I came across, I had been tracking some of this before, but I came across the TESCREAL concept, which was coined by Timnit Gebru and Émile Torres, who are variously involved with the kind of critical AI side of academia and scholarship. And what they argue is that this is essentially an acronym that describes an interrelated cluster of beliefs, many of which are influencing billionaires and justifying billionaires' use of these technologies to increase inequality in society. And I had been tracking some of these terms already, but not all billionaires subscribe to each term. And so it was kind of, I wasn't sure exactly how to frame everything in relation to each other. So I was really excited when I found this acronym, because it kind of lets you cut through that issue, because it's like, because all of the beliefs are interrelated, it kind of allows them to be talked about in conversation with each other. So just briefly, they're referring to, and I'll explain these in a second. So transhumanism is the T, and then extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and longtermism. And so transhumanism especially is the idea that humans can evolve beyond its current physical and mental limitations using advanced technologies. And there's a lot behind each of these ideas. So I'm just going to give like a very high level way of thinking about it, but there's definitely more nuance. Extropianism has been described as a kind of libertarian transhumanism. It's the idea that humans can counter entropy and thus ultimately extend the human lifespan, perhaps infinitely. Singularitarianism is the idea that technology will advance to a point where it begins to design itself, which will open up an accelerating exponential development towards singularity. Cosmism is the goal of maximizing space exploration, colonization, and even, if possible, resurrection of the dead. Rationalism is the idea that reason should be the source of and basis for knowledge. And although that sounds fine on the surface, there is a tendency towards hierarchy in this kind of social group around rationalism, and a desire to perfect understanding through reason. And then in effect, oftentimes it's a kind of translation of all variables into like numbers and sort of flattening a lot of detail that other people would say is important to consider when you're looking at problems. The last ones are, so effective altruism, which many of you might have heard about recently because of Sam Bankman-Fried, who was just recently determined to be guilty for his SBF, or that's his name. I forget the name of his company now, but he had the big crypto exchange that ended up just stealing a bunch of people's money. And basically like his rationale for doing that was like, I need to make a lot of money to be able to give back, as part of his justification based on this effective altruism idea, which essentially champions the use of science and reason to determine the most high impact applications of philanthropy. But in practice, it involves that kind of flattening of everything into numbers that I described in rationalism. And it also has a kind of ends justifies the means mentality that I will argue is quite harmful. And then finally, longtermism is the idea that kind of emerged out of effective altruism, that community, and it orients a moral duty specifically to colonize space to maximize the well-being of distant future digital people. So all of these ideas kind of like developed, the arc of them starts from like the earliest until the most recent. So they developed in kind of this order, but they all informed each other. And ultimately the most dangerous combination, while like some people, this is not, I should emphasize this, it's not the case that every effective altruist is trying to take over the world and do diabolical things by any means. The problem is that when you combine some of these ideas together, like transhumanism, effective altruism, and long-termism, it creates an ideology that justifies the extreme hoarding of wealth because you have decided that you are cosmically important for the development of consciousness in the universe. And so that is currently widely shared, that sort of core view among many billionaires and people with a lot of power in Silicon Valley. And so once I discovered like all of that, the past few slides of language, and realized the connections between AI and psychedelics, I realized the framing for my paper, which was that the psychedelic hype and AI hype are actually interconnected. And this is a quote from my paper. Sorry, I'll go back. So it's the presence of these parallels is understandable when one considers their underlying affinities, like two blooms from one plant. The same Silicon Valley and venture capital forces are investing enormous amounts of capital to develop both as cultivars in their own image, selecting for desired traits that further the existing socioeconomic order. And so that's the context for the paper. And then I go through some case studies of different major figures in the psychedelic industry, specifically to show how some of the ideologies that are circulating and the kind of the framing of what psychedelics are and why they're being built out in these new kind of systems can be used to actually work towards the exact opposite of what many people are saying psychedelics are going to help with. So instead of, well, it's like, and I argue there's at the fringes of this, the most kind of concerning elements. So this is not to say everyone in the field is like this, but if we kind of just go along with what some people are trying to do, they're essentially doing a bait and switch where they're promising these outcomes for the climate, for political polarization, for the rise of fascism, but actually what they're doing structurally and building systems that are designed to increase inequality are actually moving in the other direction, despite what they're saying. So in this context, like MAPS is very significant, obviously, to the field in terms of like, just the ways that people are conceiving of what this field is. So even beyond their organization, they have a big impact on the way that people talk about psychedelics as medicines. And so, here's a picture of Doblin from the recent psychedelic science conference, standing in front of a, screen that says toward a world of net zero trauma by 2070. And so I was just kind of thinking through some of the ideas that I have seen MAPS express, claiming things like psychedelics will be a catalyst for mass mental health through their capacity to change individual perspectives. So without systemic change, moving towards this net zero trauma by 2070 in terms of describing the stakes of how important it is that they're successful in their work. And Doblin also recommends this idea of mass mental health. He uses that phrase a lot, specifically theorized through this mechanism of spiritualizing humanity through this, access to unitive mystical experiences, with the idea that people will, realize that all different religions are just kind of metaphorical interpretations of this shared perspective that's kind of like the true religion, and then people will get past their infighting and just want to care about each other more. And then throughout a lot of the descriptions of these ideas, there are evidence of ends justifies the means thinking, because that's part of the problems that I was noting throughout a lot of these different ideologies, is that when something is cosmically significant, it can justify a lot of minor harms or render harms as minor in the context of that larger kind of great chain perspective. And so just although my section on maps is quite small, I emphasize the way that some of this framing and the ends justifies the means logic has kind of set up a lot of the Silicon Valley specific ideologies to kind of come in and incorporate these kinds of perspectives. And so some of the other case studies I looked at, so before I published Ronan Levy and Field Trip Health, that company folded, but they were positioning themselves as one of the most important kinds of companies in the space, and specifically were rolling out ketamine clinics. And in this case, when a lot of the tech industry layoffs started happening, they started advertising free ketamine-assisted therapy to deal with job loss specifically. And it stood out to me because this is something I touch on. Instead of medicating the distress of job loss with ketamine at at wellness clinics for like highly, relatively privileged tech workers that have, a lot going for them in general, versus like some of the people who are at the lower ends of society in terms of like access to material resources in general. It's distracting from the possibility of like joining unionizing efforts to actually push back against that structural issue of the disposability of labor and join in like solidarity with the lower paid gig workers, especially that industry depends on. And what I mean by that, I'll go into that in a second. I'll come back to that. Another idea that Ronan Levy said that kind of reflected some of his Silicon Valley informed thinking around the way he was talking about the value of psychedelics is this idea, this kind of trickle down ecstasis idea that comes from the book Stealing Fire. The term comes from Stealing Fire. But this is a quote Ronan Levy said: even if you only serve rich white men with access to psychedelic therapies, it's going to change them in a way that I think is constructive and positive, and will create an army of people who are more open-minded and more willing to think about how we address the challenges of equity. And then this is the key line: I know it seems counterintuitive that creating more inequity is going to create equity, but I do genuinely believe that there's that's a possible outcome here. And the reason, so the trickle down ecstasis idea is like, because rich people have the most power in society, if we can just get them to be a little bit more open-minded and use their money well, that's how we can change the world. It's sort of like an elite focused, way of thinking about how social change can happen. But the term itself, like trickle down, comes from trickle down economics, where, a similar promise happened, where it's like, we just need to let the wealthy keep their wealth and they'll create jobs and it will lead to economic growth. But in reality, we've found that the wealthy tend to keep their wealth and to reinvest it in ways to make themselves money, and it doesn't actually filter down to society. So, the idea that we can just kind of keep prioritizing the already powerful to fix problems, I would say, gets back to what Naomi Klein was saying. It is itself a symptom of the problem itself and how we ended up in the situation in the world that we have today. And just in terms of like why I was mentioning instead of just taking ketamine, actually trying to address the extractive Silicon Valley worker system that's disenfranchised labor, is because a lot of people don't realize, but all of these companies, all of the big Silicon Valley companies, are relying on a vast tasker underclass of people, many of whom are from refugees, war-torn countries, people who have experienced economic collapse, who are now, their only job opportunities are to annotate and label data for AI systems. And the quote that I have here is, there's a picture first of like different cars and people being labeled to help, automated vehicles be able to navigate. But there's an example that I quote where, someone in a conflict zone is now kind of forced to annotate, because they have no other job options, annotate the maps of streets where he used to live, potentially to help guided missiles to hit those very streets. So he's literally kind of been conscripted into this colonial exploitative system with no other options. And this is the kind of work that a lot of the AI field in Silicon Valley field is like moving towards, where we're still going to need people to help serve the machines essentially by labeling data in this way so that it's usable, but it's not meaningful, and it doesn't allow for personal advancement or any kind of progress, because you're just kind of you're plugged into the matrix essentially. And that's the reality of what a lot of these systems are depending on. So from my perspective, it's like, we need to address this machine. We need to address this empire, this colonizing thing that is currently designing the world to extract from the bottom and concentrate at the top, if we really care about climate change and political polarization and all the rest. And that gets us to Christian Angermeyer, who says the quiet part out loud too often. I think he talks to a lot of other very wealthy people, many of whom keep some of these ideas to themselves, but he, for whatever reason, comes out and says a lot openly. And in particular, he's an out and out kind of transhumanist, first of all. So he's very much, racing to escape death, trying to evolve past the human form. And he's unabashed that like the elite drive to do that is what's right and best for everybody. Not because everyone's going to benefit, but just because that is the way things should be. And so he talks about the use of psychedelics within that perspective as, he's open about the fact that the world that the elites are building is not good for mental health. And he says that we need to help people who are, brought into that tasker kind of world where suddenly people have no options and they're annotating for AI. We need to make them excited about that perspective, or else they'll rebel. And he's very open about that, the need to like stop rebellion from happening. And he admits that like that kind of world, the refugee camp, data annotation, the world that we're building with all the technology, and he says, I'm part of the builders, that's why I'm conscious of that, is not good for our mental health. And so he is, behind Atai Life Sciences. He was a original kind of funder for Compass Pathways. And what he is envisioning psychedelics as doing is much more akin to what Aldous Huxley talked about with Soma, which is a way to kind of prevent the lower classes from rebelling against a system that ultimately does not serve their interests. And he talks about using psychedelics to address fear of the future, but essentially resistance to the world developing as further and further entrenching the rich and the wealthy. And he says we need to be more open to new models of living and job opportunities, but in that sense. And then the other major figure, I touch on from the tech side is Sam Altman, who is interesting for my argument because he's both in psychedelics and AI. He's the CEO of OpenAI, which was behind ChatGPT that I mentioned before, and he's also on the board of Journey Collab, which is a psychedelics company, and he's like Angermeyer, kind of openly transhumanist and also explicitly long-termist. And long-termist being the idea that, which I should have focused on more before it, the idea that the well-being of distant future generations matter more than the people who are alive today. So he mentions we can colonize space, we can get fusion to work and solar energy to mass scale, we can cure all human diseases, we can build new realities. We are only a few breakthroughs away from abundance at scale that is difficult to imagine. It's obviously better to save 1 million lives in the future than one life today. So a lot of these figures are saying that, we need to get this technology to develop this artificial general intelligence and get consciousness digitized, get off planet, and then we won't need this planet anymore. And that goal is actually where all of cosmic history has been evolving towards in the first place. And so if a few people need to die or suffer along the way, it's like stepping on an anthill. Like, it's not ultimately significant in the cosmic scheme of things. And then describing Journey Collab's Indigenous reciprocity initiatives, he's open about the fact that he thinks about reciprocity as an extractive form of, getting knowledge that you can then capitalize on. He says those Indigenous communities will share with Journey Collab what they know of the history of these medicines, and Journey will share what Silicon Valley is good at with how to use capitalism to develop something, to deliver something to people who can really benefit from it. But again, the emphasis is ultimately on extraction of wealth into the hands of the capitalists. And just as I get towards the end here, I wanted to really emphasize, because this is one of the core takeaways of my paper, long-termism is a colonial concept. It's based on colonizing the stars, ends justifies the means reasoning, transcendence of the natural world that we know. And that idea is incompatible with Indigenous reciprocity. Incompatible, it's completely incompatible. And what I think has happened here is that we have situations, we'll show I'll skip forward a second. We have situations where transhumanist long-termists like Christian Angermeyer, open TESCREALists, are having fireside chats on a stage with Rick Toblin. And then meanwhile, there are Indigenous speakers, and there's an Indigenous protest that happened at the end of psychedelic science. But under the big tent of the psychedelics field, there are actually incompatible worldviews. I think a lot of people think that they've personally had empathetic, positive psychedelic experiences, and so everyone must, sort of have this, and we're all working towards the same end. We all are on the same team. But actually, many of the goals of major actors in this space are working in opposite directions from other people who are trying to have a more pro-social, pro-environmental, benefiting this planet sort of perspective. So just going back to this idea, with the long-termist idea, the fact that climate change is happening is just helping us get off planet. This is we only need this planet as fuel to create the technology and then digitize consciousness and leave, and then it can burn, it's fine. That idea is not the same as people who are who see the earth and the water as being essential relatives, parts of us, things that need protecting. And yet the two ideas on the surface sound like they could be compatible, because long-termism sounds like the idea that, oh, we need to think about not just the immediate moment, but concern for future generations, which has a parallel with various Indigenous concepts collectively known as the honorable harvest, the idea that the seventh generation out should benefit from our actions. And yet when you peel below the superficial similarity, they're actually completely contradictory concepts. And a lot of this I got from developed in relation to Indigenous scholars who are working in psychedelic studies, including Uriah Seladwin, and also Keith Williams and Suzanne Brandt, that I cite here. And they specifically talk about how long-termism, that kind of, they don't mention that word, but capitalism in general tends to have a kind of colonial hierarchization of all life. And those systems like long-termism justify rendering certain elements as disposable or as acceptable sacrifices in the context of a more worthy cause. Whereas a lot of Indigenous perspectives see everything as related to each other, and that we need to actually consider the well-being of relationships in the here and now, and not just justify the consumption and exploitation of what we have within our reach towards some transcendent, distant future. And so just to end with this idea here, so I mentioned that I mean, psychedelic science 2023 was essentially, for me, a microcosm. Like all of this debate after the Indigenous protest happened, I wasn't at the conference, but it was coming up online as I was finishing my paper. And I was like, this is exactly in microcosm, the themes that I have been interested in exploring. And so I noticed that there was kind of a rush after the protest, which was essentially saying, this is not a collective liberation movement. This is a capitalization, this is an exploitation. There was a rush by some sectors of the field to quickly assume an outcome. Like, it was described in Lucid News as an ego death and collective healing moment, and it mentions that there was a hug at the end, and it implies that like very superficial changes could happen, like a few extra comp tickets and Indigenous speakers, and then all would be good. But what I was arguing here is that actually, like, no, the ideas are fundamentally incompatible, and we need to be more attentive to the fact that some highly wealthy sectors of the field are trying to use psychedelics as a tool for further extraction and exploitation. And especially because it's only through the wealthy controlling the world's resources that we can kind of successfully create the technology that we need to get off planet. And just to end, I wanted to mention some cautionary lessons from the early internet. Because in the beginning of the internet, there were utopian hopes that the technology would be this tool for connecting people across the planet and democratizing people, free sharing of information. But in practice, the way the internet was built out has resulted in digital oligarchy, where there's now these major platforms that are controlled and used for behavioral control in order to motivate people not to live healthy, happier lives, but to actually generate more profit for the companies. But I mentioned in my paper, a different internet was possible. It didn't have to get built out that way. And we're now at a similar place for both AI and psychedelics, where it's like the systems are getting built out, and we have the opportunity to build systems that are actually going to be reinvesting in the world and having people, address the kind of root causes of some of the problems that we're dealing with. Or we can have systems that are built out to extract money for the wealthy and powerful. And part of my worry with the nascent stage that we're at in relation to that topic is that both AI and psychedelics, that they're actually related in the sense that AI is described as like a stochastic parrot. So it takes the ideologies that are embedded in, for example, the language models, and then it repeats out and kind of reflects it out in kind of slight new combinations, but you find the same biases that were in the original data set becoming amplified. And psychedelics similarly are non-specific amplifiers, and that if what you're building into a trip experience is a certain kind of protocol that is invested in problematic ideologies that justify, a more hierarchical order of the world, then you can expect that will influence the kinds of experiences people have and the kinds of interpretations they have of those experiences. And that they could be used potentially in the kind of Soma type way that Christian Angermeyer was envisioning. And so I argue just at the end of the paper that right now the same utopian hype is, I would argue, desensitizing people from noticing how elite decisions are optimizing both AI and psychedelics for profit. And that if we do want AI and psychedelics to be used as forces for healing, connection, and expression, now is the time to name and to resist the corporate takeover of both industries, because we might not get a second chance. And I say that because the systems are getting built out, the standards, the expectations, the framings, and also for AI, I mean, the ideas that we're getting to a place where there's going to be more AI text than more synthetic text than human generated text. And so the echoes of existing biases and power relations can just kind of get magnified over time. And so now is kind of a crucial moment to, if we want things to not be tuned towards optimizing profit, we have the chance to still intervene and say something. And the very last thing I'll end on is this kind of perspective from Mark Fisher in Acid Communism, who is kind of arguing, I mean, he wrote this right before he died, after he wrote Capitalist Realism, where he was describing how for many people, it's harder to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capital. It's harder to imagine the end of capitalism than it is to imagine the end of the world. The people just assume that capitalism is like the way things are. But he has another perspective, and essentially like envisioning the use of psychedelics and psychedelic consciousness to see the contingency behind dominant assumptions, behind powerful narratives, to see that it is not the way that things have to be. And I think about Philip K. Dick, like the idea of the man in the high castle, a story, a different way of looking at things can be so dangerous because it shows that things can be otherwise. And so I think that psychedelics do have this potential to show to kind of pierce the veil behind the established order of extraction and colonialism as being just the way things are, so that people can really start to dream and organize to build a better world. And Fisher says, what if the counterculture was only a stumbling beginning rather than the best that could be hoped for? What if the success of neoliberalism, the kind of ascendancy of capitalism, was not an indication of its inevitability, but a testament to the scale of the threat posed by the kind of psychedelic insight, the specter of a society which could be free? And I think that is worth holding and sharing and working towards. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Neşe. Thank you. I think we have a question here in the room. Leader, please.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you. My question is actually if you can follow conceptually on the last slide you shared, what would practices, situations, in which you think psychedelics can be used with this kind of emancipatory ideals in a better society? So what is the setting of such a thing?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, it's one of the things I've been talking about recently a lot is interest in like the commons of psychedelics and like mutual aid approaches to sharing best practices and hard lessons learned through community networks. And some of this has come out recently for me in terms of critiquing some of Michael Pollan's writing, especially his op-eds in like the New York Times and other places, where he has been very explicit about the fact that psychedelics can only be accessed safely and legitimately through very rigid hierarchical systems, where like whether it's a psychiatrist or certain disciplines like science having this like knowledge that like you as an individual need to go to these guides and these ones who know to be able to like access these states. I'm much more interested in kind of like, I'm open to a diversity of models. And for some people, I think a therapist might be helpful, but I think that normalizing that that's the only way that you can experience psychedelics does not make sense to do for a number of reasons that, I won't fully get into. But one of the things that I have been interested in like developing is this idea, or kind of, because people have been sharing psychedelics with friends for, many years and like just on a more horizontal level. But I think that because it's such an elephant in the room right now in terms of like a lot of the thought leaders are not really talking about that perspective on things, I have been developing a kind of thinking of a metaphor parallel with safety divers in the freediving community. Excuse me. And specifically because with freediving, you're holding your breath, you're going really deep. Because you're going low on oxygen, there's aspects of altered consciousness. And there's a lot of risk because as you're coming back to the surface, sometimes you black out, and it's really good to have someone there who is able to support you. But the safety divers are people who are there to support someone to go deep, especially if they're trying to push a record, that they haven't done before. And what's great about what I think is really interesting about the safety divers is that they're not some, messianic guru who has this sacred spiritual knowledge that you can't ever have access to. They're members of the freediving community who are at other times, the ones that go deep and push their limits. And so they're not this like separate outside force. They're people who are in community with the people that they're supporting. And they're trained on the kind of basic things. So they know, they've done like hand signals so you can communicate underwater. They know to look for signs of someone having distress. If something happens that's stressful and someone blacks out, they're able to like kind of bring them back and then help them do, breathing to help calm them down, different kinds of like regulation things. And it allows the person to actually focus on going deep. So similarly with social groups, more horizontal social groups, sometimes you might want to have someone who's able to like help light a DMT pipe or something like that, allow you to focus on breathing, just going deep. And so I think there's a lot of like benefit to having others around, other knowledgeable people who are trained and have experience. But I don't think that this like rigid hierarchy is the most helpful way in general, and especially not to normalize that as the only legitimate, safe way of accessing psychedelics. And interestingly, a lot of the people who say that is the only legitimate way of accessing, like themselves have tripped with friends, but they say like for the masses, like you need to have some kind of leader to guide you through. So kind of developing other ways of conceptualizing psychedelic use and psychedelic communities outside of hierarchical power relationships, I think is one small step towards kind of like a different approach to how we're engaging with these substances and experiences.
That's great. Did you have
Yeah, if I can follow up.
Yeah.
No, it's great. I really agree with that approach. But just to kind of going back to Mark Fisher and, emancipatory, and maybe that some experiences do lead you to see things in different ways and then motivate you to change towards them. So you think that in a horizontal community, more of such experiences can happen that are actually liberating, let's say, from frameworks of hierarchical society?
Well, I think, in principle, not that it has to in that way, but I think in principle, having communities that you are living with and dealing with like real world issues on the ground in relationship to have kind of shared goals and needs in terms of community building, and that you can then use psychedelics more easily as a tool for connection. Because it's like, if you're able to support people who are in your circles, that's something that can kind of add to your bonds with people, and you can kind of use those kinds of connections to build community and to serve as like resilience and connection in order to do the necessary organizing that's going to need to happen to change the kind of dominant systems that are in the world today. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is it's like harm reduction in the sense of right now, especially with the co-therapist dyad, guides who are kind of overseeing a lot of psychedelic experiences in the kind of dominant way. Oftentimes they're people that are very privileged, trained in the same way, kind of have a certain perspective on often capitalism is a good thing. And so when you're having a big expansive experience and then you're coming down from it into integration with two people who are trained often to kind of interpret this as like, well, what is this about you and your individual problems? And kind of like, I think there's subtly pressure that can happen to like discourage some of the systems thinking and kind of creative engagement with these deeper systemic problems if the people that are kind of the construct of the room is designed to kind of not go there. So I think it also opens up space to more explore these other possibilities that otherwise could get snuffed out just by like dominant ideological assumptions.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think that's a very interesting parallel as well with deep diving and safety. It reminds me of the work that's already happening, I guess, with organizations like Psychedelics in the UK, I believe, Zendo Project perhaps in the US, where it's not an authority, but it's a peer, and often the volunteers are service users themselves. So I definitely see how that can happen in community and can be promoted as a model. We do have a question from Mark.
Hey, Neşe. I was really intrigued by that trickle-down ecstasis idea and the stochastic parrot. Just not just because they're incredible memes, but they really do refer to something real, I think. When tech workers laid off are moving to privileged ketamine therapy instead of unionizing, for example. My question kind of comes off the back of Leo's and asks for more like maybe say less hypothetical or theoretical and more like real world examples of that. So this kind of horizontalization of hierarchy that you suggest, and the critique that expertise, especially in the clinical model, kind of cultivates notions of the privatization of stress and things like that. So it seems that implicitly, to me, that would point the finger or critique more easily clinical models and also critique kind of more guru / shamanic models in favor of more community organizing, free party models, and say psychedelic religions like Daime and the NAC, which seem to democratize that that spiritual expertise and democratize those responsibilities for the other in the space. Is that fair? What other specific models would be preferable? Like, for example, group therapy in the clinical space, is that preferable to, would you say preferable actually to one-on-one, for example? And would models that subject shamans and gurus to de-emphasis also be preferable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I can see a lot of ways that group therapy like could go wrong. So I don't think that the structure itself is like necessarily, you know, would necessarily address some of the concerns I have with the single therapy. And particularly because like the main concern is to me, the naturalization or like the hegemonic presentation of a view of psychedelics and of reality and of mental health that actually reinforces a narrative about the existing structure being inevitable and right. That is like the core concern I have. And so if the therapists in a group setting still have that same, you know, capitalism is good actually, and if you have problems, it's because you're, you know, some individual trauma instead of the fact that you are trying to work 3 jobs and you don't have clean water and you don't have health insurance and all of these other things. Like, because, and essentially like one of my, you know, my colleagues at the Ohio State University, I was kind of advising on a paper that they were working on related to liberation psychology. And in that like kind of tradition, which comes, you know, there's a lot of development in South and Central America, there's an emphasis on attending to systemic factors and then mobilizing towards community organizing to address those factors as part of healing. And so it's like that sort of approach where you're like bringing in these other aspects that kind of open the door for attention to be directed towards social change. That to me is like the kind of the core thing. So I do think group, you know, therapy could be helpful if there's kind of more of those systemic aspects that are emphasized. But if not, it can just be like there's I forget the name of the psychological bias, but they showed like different sizes of lines, and like people, I think maybe this is an aspect of groupthink, but people, there was like an obviously wrong choice, but if the other people who were answering first answered the wrong choice, and that they were actors that were paid to do this, oftentimes the actual participant would say the wrong choice, even though it was obviously wrong. So if you have a group setting and everyone is like, the existing power structure is good actually, and if you have problems, it's because you're not working hard enough, like that kind of thing, it can actually backfire. So, and that to me is like part of the issue, though, is that the ideas that are preferred by the powerful tend to be represented in a way that like forecloses other ways of looking at things. So again, I'm open to like multiple options and like people choosing things that work for them. The problem with a lot of the dominant assumptions is that they tend to say this is the only legitimate, responsible way of doing it. And it's like that normalization of existing power structures that is the core problem. So I don't know if I completely answered you, but that's, I think it can be that kind of shift in perspective that's more focused on systemic factors can come into even, you know, small groups where there's only one person taking the psychedelic, but it just is the current kind of ways of talking about psychedelics tends to not emphasize those perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neşe. We have a question from Rennie as well.
Hi, Neşe. So obviously, we're talking about this in an academic context, and academia itself is very like hierarchical, and part of this like systemic system that you talk about. Sorry, systemic system doesn't make sense, but whatever, you get what I mean. So how do you sort of, and obviously it's like the idea of a publication or of propagating an idea in that space is kind of hierarchical, that there's some power dynamic there. How do you get around that fact, or how do you personally deal with that sort of conflict, I suppose?
Maybe we can link this also. There is a comment on the chat about how we can see authoritarianism is not exclusive to the political right. We can also see that with left-wing activists, and Lucius here notes some issues that may be driven by ego-focused needs and narcissism, which I think is the case on any side really. But I think what is the agenda there? I think what Rennie is highlighting there is that there is power even in these publications or in the system. So I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah, it was a big topic for sure. I tried to, in my paper, let me back up for a second. So I've had a lot of bad experiences doing kinds of work with people, collaborations, like under like PIs, like, you know, full professor, like bosses, stuff like that, that were very extractive, like where I would like offer to do something, and then as soon as I agreed, I was like asked to do all this other stuff, or kind of expected to do all this other stuff that I never agreed to, and then things were done and kind of like the person who was overseeing it wasn't actually contributing, but then like took stuff that they weren't even like. So I've experienced a lot of that, and that, talking to other people in academia, that's very common, in part because like academia, especially the tenure kind of hierarchy, does tend to reward people who are able to mobilize and extract from the work of like grad students and other kinds of people below them, because it's like they have all these publications. And so you tend to see a higher representation of those types of people who are willing to kind of play fast and loose with consent, you know, to get to the top. And that's definitely a problem. What I tried to do with my paper was to a few things. I tried really hard to cite full context of like where I had encountered things before, and acknowledge the work of like a lot of other people that had kind of come into my own thinking, and to kind of really emphasize that this isn't about me and my work, and I'm not a thought leader, but like I'm part of a community of thinkers, and kind of connecting out laterally that way. I also, the very use of a term that was trying to be mobilized in critical AI studies, I also saw that as an act of solidarity, because it's like, especially because a lot of times within the fields themselves, within AI studies, within psychedelic studies, the people who have the more critical anti-establishment sort of perspectives tend not to be the ones that are highly funded, because the ideas that are most conducive, like I've described them as kind of like court philosophers, where it's like people who are able to articulate ideas that are in the interest of the wealthy and powerful, tend to get invited to TED Talks and all these other locations. So although we are minorities in our respective fields, by kind of coming together and noticing similar kinds of critique and concern across fields, we are able to actually be a bigger force and actually learn from each other things that we have different perspectives on, because we're in different fields. So in my case, I felt like I was able to add to the TESCREAL concept the notion that actually, I think the fact that so many billionaires are taking psychedelics together is likely fueling conviction in these TESCREAList kind of perspectives, because of the phenomenology of psychedelics and the way that it can kind of contribute to grandiose perspectives on cosmic hierarchies. And so that's an example of like how bringing a different discipline's expertise to a topic can actually contribute to it. So I think that there are ways to start to like, you know, work in non-hierarchical, non-extractive ways that are really emphasizing community, even in the structure of argumentation and the way that ideas are being brought together, that can start to kind of move in a different direction. And I also, at Hopkins, I teach writing. So I teach people how to think about ideas like through the concepts of drugs and society and psychedelics, but teach critical thinking. And so my paycheck in this case is not dependent on extracting and exploiting workers below me. And so I think that there are ways to actually start shifting academia more and more to incentivize, actually, not the pure number of publications. I mean, obviously, like, it takes a while to change things, but I think that there are ways to start to kind of shift it. And I do also think that it's important to incorporate voices, perspectives that are not just in academic contexts, and that, understanding that academia is a certain sort of incentive system, and that there are ideas that have not managed to flourish in that incentive system that are really important perspectives on these conversations. And so really starting to bring in other perspectives and value other kinds of expertise beyond just that has been traditionally rewarded by academic systems.
Thank you, Neşe. Did you have a question as well?
Just briefly, I was just wondering, given your research and your experience, how optimistic are you that it is possible for this to go any other way than what we're witnessing and seeing in what is a sort of an ideological takeover and the tech bro culture and all of that? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work to be done for sure, and it's not necessarily determined what way things are going to go. Like, the internet became, very controlled by tech companies ultimately. In this case, I do think a lot of the pretense of the kind of extractive, profit-focused versions of psychedelics is premised on very shaky foundation. It's premised on you cannot do this safely outside of this system. And so I think that the more that an alternative is built out and advocated for, I think ultimately a lot of people will be more attracted to that vision of things than they are to, conscription by this larger force. So I think that there is, even though it's a sort of David and Goliath situation a bit in terms of the wealth, inequality between people who are trying to make a new extractive system versus people who are trying to not do that. I do think that the power of the story, the power of the community organizing can be enough. I not to say it will be enough. I think it can be enough. And I personally find it very rewarding to at least work in that direction. So, but definitely an open question, I would say.
Okay, perfect. I think we have, because Neşe, you said you need to leave a few minutes early, but we have a long question from Oliver, I believe. If you wanted to read, sir, your question, Oliver? Or I can read this out for you. So Oliver says, apologies for the long question. Perhaps an intractable problem because we live in a capitalist value system, but I'm wondering if it is worth recognizing the elite as people suffering from inequality as well. For example, depression levels tend to be much higher among the elite compared to others closer to the bulge of the socioeconomic bell curve. The baseline is that the environment in which the elite exists is very different from the default existence of the vast majority of humanity. This informs everything elites do, including psychedelics, and what they would get out of a trip, as you have mentioned in your talk. And this whole context, defining the positions people occupy in society, all come down to a structure of inequality that recreates itself, almost like a living being surviving and thriving. I'm wondering if it is possible to solve any of these issues without the capitalist value system in low.
Yeah, there's something that came to mind in relation to that. I don't know if it's fully addressing the perspective or question, but I do think that, there's been a lot of scholarship on the psychology of wealth inequality. And so people who are in the billionaire type echelon of society, it leads to issues with empathy, because you're kind of in this like separate bubble, and so you're not seeing what life is like for the average person. And also a lot of people, I forget the name of the bias, but there's a lot of people who because they succeeded, they over evaluate like their faith in their own work efforts and work ethic and their intuitions about things. And so they're often more they feel like if their intuition says to do something, it must be right because look at where they've gotten, that sort of idea. And so I mean, it's various kinds of like stunting, like because you're not developing in a way that is like naturally integrated into like community, and you're like getting feedback from people who have different perspectives. And a lot of people are actually surrounded by yes men who just kind of filter back what the person wants to hear. And so I do not in any sense want to suggest that these people are evil. I think it is just a reflection of their place in the system, that they're kind of stunted in these kind of core ways. And to me, it's like, I've thought about it in relation to like a kind of like a petulant toddler that like really wants to have cookies at every meal and stamps their foot and says like, you know, no, I want to have it this way. In that context, people can recognize, oh, this is underdeveloped, you know, still a developing child, and we don't want to blindly follow what the small, you know, dictator is trying to have the world be, that there are reasons that we shouldn't follow the whims of the toddler. It's sort of similar here, where it's like, for whatever reason, people are, or I would say for multiple reasons, people are, for figures like Elon Musk, really committed to the idea that he is this like fifth dimensional chess, like superhero genius. And so they're kind of willing to follow him even off a cliff, you know. But I think that like a more mature society would identify severe, you know, narcissism and kinds of like, you know, elite desires as, you know, through a lens of compassion, but with boundaries. Like, you know, no, we're not just gonna do this because you think that we should. We're going to kind of like come to consensus and get perspectives from other people who care about an issue and integrate their, and because another part of this is like, so much of the problems with existing systems are only seen by people who are at the bottom of society, like so-called, like the people at the lower ends. And this comes up, I even had a job interview one time where I interviewed with every person in the organization, including the people who work on like the website and don't have like advanced degrees. And then by the time after I interviewed with like the top PhD, you know, lead of the organization, they told me that part of the reason they do that is that everyone can be put on a good face for the person at the top, but that you get to see more about people in terms of how they interact with the people who are, you know, lower down, who have less power. And so you know, when people have sort of pathological drives to kind of use people instrumentally and take from others, sometimes you can only tell that from the people who have seen the mask slip, and they've seen that there's more going on than meets the eye of, oh, that person was really nice to me. And so we need, there's data, important information that we can only access if we are opening the doors of conversation and community to people who have experienced the ways that the system that seems to be functioning fine is actually breaking down and isn't right. So we need to be able to like reframe who it is that we're listening to, and how we're kind of incorporating different perspectives and how we move forward. So I hope that was useful somewhere. But thank you all so very much for having me, and I appreciate, I had not presented on this material yet, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk through some of this with all of you.